So now I'm very excited to welcome Ayana Mathis, celebrating the release of The Unsettled. Ayana Mathis's first novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, was a New York Times bestseller, an NPR Best Book of 2013, and a selection for Oprah's Book Club. It's been translated into 16 languages. Her nonfiction has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and Rolling Stone. She was born in Philadelphia and currently lives in New York City, where she teaches writing in Hunter College's MFA program. Mathis will be in conversation with Soyica Diggs Colbert. She is the Idle Family Professor of African American Studies and Performing Arts at Georgetown, author of the award-winning Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry, a contributor to the New York Times, Washington Post, Public Books, and American Theater, and associate director at the Shakespeare Theater Company here in Washington, D.C. Colbert is also a 2023 Guggenheim Fellow. So now, please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Ayana Mathis and Soyica Diggs Colbert.
Hi. Hello. So I just want to join in the applause by saying that if you have yet to read this magnificent, beautiful novel, I encourage you to run and get your copy as soon as we finish talking. And I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. It's such a beautiful book.
Oh, thank you. I am too. We've never met. This is our first time meeting.
But you know, one of my favorite ways to meet folks is through their work. So this is,
I know,
yeah. So I think we're going to begin with Ayana reading a little bit from the novel. And then I have a few questions, but we also want to leave time at the end for you to ask questions as well.
Bear with me as I figure out what I'm reading. Hi! How are you? So I'm going to read from sort of the early part of the novel. There's not a tremendous amount you need to know. The novel opens in a sort of unusual setting, which is a homeless shelter. And it's a shelter for families and children. And the main characters, there's three main characters in this book. One's name is Ava, and there's a woman named Dutchess who's her mother. Ava's in Philadelphia with her son, Toussaint, and her mother is in a sort of mythological black town in Alabama called Bonaparte. Where I'm going to read, Ava and her son Toussaint have been in this shelter for about 5 days at this point. So I'm just going to read a brief little bit here. The shelter is called the Glen Avenue Family Shelter. On the 5th day at Glen Avenue, Ava got $60 in emergency funds, rushed through, Ava was informed, by Miss Simmons herself. Miss Simmons is a slightly diabolical social worker. There was a lot of to-do about signing for the money, but once Ava was through with all of that, she went out and got a few things she and Toussaint needed. 2 cans of Raid, for starters. She emptied both in one go, and room 813 stank so bad their eyes watered for 2 days. Every morning, they found roaches twitching on their backs, on the window ledge, on the floor, half-dead bugs dropping from the ceiling. But Toussaint was a good boy. He acted like he didn't see them, but at least they could sit on the beds. Ava took the sheets to the laundromat and washed them on the hottest setting 2 times through. Their suitcases and trash bag were still closed up tight in the corner of the room, only one closet in there. The metal hanger bar rusty and bent in the middle, a layer of something sticky on the single shelf, and a sweaty shoe smell that turned Ava's stomach. She'd shut the door fast, and it stayed shut. But maybe she was almost glad that their other things were safe from that filth. But maybe that stuff wasn't safe either, left behind in New Jersey. She's left her husband. His name is Abemi. What would Abemi do with their keepsakes and winter clothes and bed linens? Rage through the rooms, throw it all out onto the highways, make a bonfire of every precious thing he could find. That one snapshot of Toussaint in his little paper crown on his first day of preschool. Her teaching certificate. 5 days at Glen Avenue, and already routine began to impose itself on them. Even in that place, they went on needing to eat and to sleep and to go to the bathroom. The family bathrooms were foul, mildew reek, wads of hair and wet toilet paper all over the floor. She and Toussaint only went in there when they couldn't hold it anymore. Ava wouldn't shower in there. They washed up at the little sink in their room. She'd made some rules. Lights on at all times. Ava slept 3 or 4 hours a night in her chair. She smashed roaches and silverfish. She used napkins from the cafeteria to wipe the insect gobs off the walls. Toussaint wrapped himself in the sheets when he got into bed. You couldn't see an inch of flesh. He was a mummy tipped onto the slab of rubber-covered mattress. He sweated in the night and woke with the sheets wet and his head pounding. Another rule: no leaving the room at night. That guard Melvin was a joke. Anybody could get in the building. Anybody did. Ava had heard men's voices in the hallways late at night. "I got you this juice bottle," she told Toussaint. "For at night." "What?" "For when you have to go to the bathroom at night." "That's nasty." "I know," she said. "I know it is." He was too old to sleep 6 feet away from his mother. They were both embarrassed. Their bodies had done them a mean turn with all the parts that dangled and secreted and swelled. "Tell me something, Ma," he said. "I can't get to sleep." Ava told him bedtime stories about her childhood in Bonaparte, like she had been doing all his life. He pretended to be comforted. Maybe he was. It made Ava feel better, too. The stories reminded her that room 813 wasn't the only reality that ever was. They sat opposite each other on the plastic chairs by the desk in their room. "Muskogee, mostly," Ava said. "With feathers?" Toussaint asked. "No feathers, Toussaint. Just hats." "Oh. Well, what else?" "Boots. Ma, you know what I mean." What else? She thought. The creak in the wide board on the porch when you climbed up onto the swing. Also, Porch Creek farmers and Choctaw traders coming into Bonaparte to barter shoes and all manner of supplies for Bonaparte's tobacco, grown or stolen, or salt pork, or corn liquor. They stopped in to see Miss Tilly on business little girls weren't supposed to know about, and then bedded down by the riverbank and were gone by morning, like it was 1820. Like anybody else in the whole world still bartered this for that with Indians in 1947. Ava's pop said Bonaparte was a place for free people. They and the Indians had been helping each other stay free for 100 years. Also, she remembered, Pop steadying the rifle on Ava's shoulders when they went hunting. Hold, hold, then the shot exploding and the wing beat when the spooked osprey flapped out of the trees and the shot wild pig crashed into the crispy summertime underbrush. Oh, and the taste of roasted pheasant, fresh killed. A pleasure Toussaint had never had. And then flood years, when game was the only food because the fields got washed out and everything rotted or never grew in the first place. Dutchess, her mother, at her piano in the front room, playing and cussing. Toussaint's next question would be about her, this grandmother he'd never met, who lived in a place so strange and far away it might as well be a fairy tale, at least in Toussaint's mind. Dutchess didn't know she had a grandson. Bonaparte was the second Negro incorporated town in Alabama, Ava said. 1868. You always say that, Ma. It's important. I know. What else? What about my grandmother? I'll stop there.
So thank you for reading that passage. It opens up so many things that I am curious about. And the first being, if you could talk some about how you were thinking about different types of care and their failure, different types of social support. And so the scene takes place in their first few days at the shelter, and which is part of the welfare state and part of how women and children are purportedly being supported in Philadelphia in the 80s and, throughout the United States. But then later in the novel, Ava reunites with Toussaint's father and they begin living on a commune essentially. And it is a fantasy or an idea of a different type of communal care. It is an idea of a different type of communal care. And they have provide health care for residents and so forth in the community, but then it has its own problems. So I wonder if you could just talk some about the tension there between different ways of caring for folks.
So the novel's really, it's set in the 80s. And it's really interested in the ways in which people who perhaps exist outside of what we think of mainstream communities find ways to be with one another and find ways to be for better and for worse, in the novel, sometimes for worse, but find ways to be in community with one another, even if they find that the ways that we are told are the ways to live don't work for them, right? And won't work for them and might have failed them. So the shelter sections, I think, are a lot about, of course, the ways in which that kind of state care fails them. But they're also, I think, a lot about the ways in which, how do I put this? I was really interested in thinking about how we assign stories to people, right? So people who live in a shelter are people who are troubled. People who live in a shelter are people who are deeply unhappy. People who live in a shelter are people who've made mistakes. People who live in a shelter are people who have no agency. All these sorts of things. And in fact, none of those things are actually true, right? Certainly living in a shelter isn't a fun time, so obviously it's not implying that. But what it is trying to say is that people who live in places that are quote unquote on some sort of margin are not marginal. They are people who are sort of living according to whatever fate has dealt them, and also according to their proclivities and their personalities and their own power and what have you. And so in a lot of the novel, I think who these people are is kind of in direct conflict with the state, but also indirect conflict with ideas about who they are supposed to be or who we think that they are. And that's very much then when we sort of get to the second part of the novel. I won't say too much about it because I don't want to spoiler alert. But there is a kind of communal place that's called Ark, and they kind of it has a utopic vision. And it is very interested in creating an alternative to the ways that most people live, and certainly an alternative that would be safer for Black people to live. And the challenges to that are numerous. I was really interested in what those challenges might be. So there are challenges from outside, there are challenges from the state, there are challenges from, there are challenges that are really basic. Like if you decide to set up a way to live that isn't the way most people live, how do you feed yourself? How do you keep the lights on? What does any of that look like? And also, of course, as you pointed out, there are internal challenges, right? Like we're not talking about a monolith of people, right? Like these are people who have different visions about things, different ideas about how things should be. They clash. The person who sort of forms this Ark place is not, I guess his name is Cass, and he was delightfully fun villain to write in a certain way. He's complicated, but he's right about a lot of things, but his methods are really not great. He is a questionable guy at best. So the point being that, inside these communities, I wasn't interested in trying to sort of mythologize, and nor was I interested in sort of creating some situation in which the Black people, this novel has all Black characters, as does my first novel, The 12 Tribes of Hattie. I wasn't interested in dehumanizing those people by making them all entirely virtuous or all entirely villainous, right? Like they just exist on a spectrum. They are not united in their visions about how things should go or things should be. And of course, those internal frictions are exacerbated by external pressures. So I don't know if I even answered your question.
No, you did, but it raises so many more exciting things because one of the things that I was taken by, many things I was taken by in the novel, but one of them was that you complicate, I think, a lot of radical Black fantasies. And so in the bit that you read from, this idea of coming from a free Black town, and, then thinking through the viability of that moving into the late 20th century, this idea of creating a separate space for Black community, and then and then sort of delving into that utopic idea and the complexities that it brings. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit more about community, because one of the things I was struck by in the novel is how Toussaint, who's a child, poor kid. Yeah, I know, poor kid. He is able to identify with the other kids at the shelter, and even at one point, some folks in a homeless encampment, in ways that his mother cannot or refuses to do. So she doesn't, even though she's living in a homeless shelter, she doesn't see herself as poor, for example. And so, could you talk some about how their experience prevents him, or his mother's perception prevents him from being able to form community in many ways, and then what you were doing by giving us these different perspectives of identification, disidentification.
So, so the easiest thing, I guess, to say about Ava, that's his mother, is that she's just really like bougie and snooty. That's probably the easiest way to describe her, is that she's super bougie and she's super snooty, but in a weird way. I mean, I think that so when they're in the shelter, as Soyica was just describing, she's very much kind of like, we shouldn't be here. This is not a place for us. These people are a mess. We, don't associate with them. Don't talk to them. And her son, of course, is looking for some kind of community. He wants to make friends. He wants to go, when they sort of enter this shelter, there's a playground there. And all this kid wants to do is go to this playground. It's all he wants. There's another time in which the shelter is having a barbecue, right? And all he wants to do in his life is to just go out and hang out with the other kids and eat some hamburgers. And she is so determined that they do not belong in this place, that they cannot share in this, that there's a sort of cosmic mistake has been made, that it sort of obscures her ability to sort of see what her kid actually needs, and to give that to him. So I think in some ways there's a lot of that going on. And I think that also in some ways she is, so this kid's looking for some kind of community. He ends up, he's very precocious in certain ways, right? He's both limited by the fact that he's only 10 and 11 when this happens, but he's also a really smart child. So he's looking for community, he's looking for something, and he's figuring things out. He's kind of like, wait, I think a lot of these adults have failed me. I don't think that the things that these people are doing kind of don't exactly make any sense. I don't think that anybody has any answers. Like, how did we get to this shelter? What are we doing here? He's understanding that other people are sort of looking at him and thinking things about him that he doesn't get. Like, the bus route that he takes to school is very telling, right? Because it passes a shelter and then it passes some housing projects, right? And so this kid is like, wait, everyone thinks that we are something because we live in this place. That doesn't make any sense. So he's really struggling with all of that. And he begins to feel like an outsider to what he calls regular people. And so as he becomes more of an outsider to regular people, he starts cutting school, and he just, he kind of wanders around the city. I'm from Philadelphia and used to cut school a lot. And so that's relatively familiar to me as an experience. But in any case, so he sort of wanders around, and he ends up meeting all of these, first just as kind of a single homeless man, but then he ends up kind of like hanging around with this group of homeless men in an encampment. And he finds there, I think, some sense of acceptance, and he feels seen, I think, right? Like, oh, these are other people that also live outside of whatever everybody was saying was normal and don't judge me in any sort of way. So I think that's a really, really important part of that Philadelphia dynamic between mom and son.
I know, and it's interesting because the folks that are rendering the judgment in many ways are outside of what we might idealize as norm. And so it's the layers of perspective versus reality are often quite poignant and telling, and I think make the characters really rich. And so could you talk some about the title? Because Unsettled resonates on so many different registers, and even when you're just talking about, Toussaint's changing perspective as he's growing up, one might see as being unsettled. So could you just talk some about the title, how you came to it, and how it resonates throughout the novel?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways I can say, because we're sort of talking about all these like very heady and exciting political themes and things like that, but sometimes at its base, I think that it really is it's a novel about a mother and a son. So it's about a fractured family, and that fractured family is fractured geographically in part, right? Because there's the mother and son, second mother and son. So Ava and Toussaint are living in Philadelphia. And then the sort of uber mother is living in this place called Bonaparte, where Ava lived herself until she was like a young woman, like in her very late teens. And then she left. So also kind of like a great migration type of thing, right? So she left this place. It emptied out of young people, essentially. And so she is unsettled quite, like literally unsettled, like geographically, right? She sort of bounces around different places. She ends up in Philadelphia. She settles in Philadelphia, but she's in a certain sense always looking for something that will replicate this home that she refuses to go back to. And that home was very, I used to kind of make a joke that it was sort of like Wakanda, but it is a little bit like Wakanda. It is both like a literal place, but it has a lot of mythological elements, right? It's on a bend in the Alabama River. There's one way in over land. There's one way in over water. There are guards people in the trees that are called watchers. There's a fire that stays lit on this shore that sort of guides people in and out who are like sailing up and down the river, who, as the book puts it, belong to Bonaparte. So it is this, and her stepfather was this, his name is Caro, and he was sort of a leader in this town. It has an illustrious and long history, though when we meet it, there are only 5 people left in it. So in a certain way, she's always kind of looking for something that could recreate the kind of magnitude and grandeur and I think independence of this place that she comes from. She leaves Bonaparte and she comes into a world in which she is not, these people, both in keeping with history and also in defiance of history, the people in Bonaparte, I mean, they were an independent Black settlement even through slavery, all the way up through Jim Crow. So her experience of the world is not as a person who is being sort of sublimated, right? She understands that there are threats all around Bonaparte, but that is not her experience of the world. And so then she comes into this world in which she is threatened very directly, and in which she, I would say almost like when I've talked to people who immigrate to the United States from Black countries, they talk about how they were, Ghanaian or Jamaican or whatever, and then they come to America and they're Black. And that's very different, right? Because you're Ghanaian in Ghana, right? You know what I mean? Like you're Zimbabwe in Zimbabwe, you know what I mean? And in America, you're Black. And so I think there's a sense in which she has a similar experience, though certainly Bonaparte is in America, so she would have understood herself as a Black person, clearly. But what that means and the shape that takes is very different when she leaves this kind of spiritual homeland. So that unsettling, I think, is also in that case. And then in the case of her son, he's born in Philadelphia, so he has never had a sense of a homeland. So he is like utterly unsettled. And then her mother wasn't born in Bonaparte, but came to it because she married someone who was from there. And she becomes this kind of custodian. And she is like one of the 5 old people that are left there, and they are like fiercely holding on to this land and trying to preserve it and trying to make a legacy for their children, all of whom have left. Who knows if any of them will come back. So she is sort of like the possessor of the homeland. And she is not unsettled in her sense of where she belongs. However, that land is threatened. It was 10,000 acres, we find out. Thriving. They had a kind of cooperative. They made pickles. They sold furniture. They did all this stuff. And when we meet it, it's 1,000 acres and there's 5 people left. So also the legacy is under enormous threat. So she also in her way is unsettled because we don't know what will happen to Bonaparte when these 5 old people die, like what will happen to the land.
Yeah. Again, some of the histories we might, I imagine as utopic renderings of Blackness become complicated in the novel. And one of the ways we see that pressure even further is because we're in Philadelphia for the most part in the 1980s. And so, just historically speaking, we get the resonance of Black Power, the Black Panther Party. One of the things that's fascinating about the 80s is that there are all of these doors presumably open institutionally for Black people because of the civil rights movement and Black Power. And at the same time, the novel also draws our attention to how moving into these new spaces presents its own sets of trouble, particularly when you're thinking about what parts of the past you're bringing with you and what you're leaving behind. So can you talk some about how Ava particularly or any of the characters struggle with their past and how it's informing their present and what they think of as their future?
Sure. So I think, the 80s are a very particular moment for many, many reasons. And I think one of the things that's happening with these characters in the book, particularly in the Philadelphia sections, but I think also even in the southern sections in Bonaparte in Alabama, they're struggling with a certain kind of disillusionment, in a certain sense that the bottom has kind of fallen out, right? Like all this stuff happens in the 60s and 70s, or well, I guess even starting in the late 50s, but certainly through the 60s and the 70s. And so all these Black liberation movements, the anti-war movement, the women's rights movement, the gay rights, all this stuff, right? So it's all this foment. And certainly it didn't like fix all the problems, but there's this moment in which like there's a window, right? Like there's a window that opens in which it's like, oh, maybe something could be meaningfully different than it has been. And people are excited, right? And there's, there's strife, there's trouble. It is not a utopia, right? It isn't perfect, but there's a sense of possibility. And then we essentially get to 1980. Reagan gets elected, and it's over. Like it's over. Even the zeitgeist changes. Like, for people who are younger in the audience, they might not remember this, but I remember like when I was a kid, now we sort of revere billionaires. I mean, we say things about them, but super like very, very wealthy people. But when I was a kid, we thought like really rich people were weird. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but it was just like, you were like, oh yeah, they're rich. They're kind of, right? Like they were an other that was like kind of strange. So it might've been cool to like have some of their cars and stuff, but we didn't have that actually aspiration. And that begins to change. Even that begins to change in the 80s, right? It's go, go, go. It's Wall Street. It's, the social programs bottom out. And then all these like crises come in, right? Like the AIDS crisis come, the crack crises come, like all this stuff happens at like the worst possible time, right? Because we had like eroded the sort of social network that would have supported people who were in trouble because of these things. And then they all come. So to sort of bring that back full circle, people are feeling, I think, went from feeling a sense of hope to a sense of hopelessness and a sense of disillusionment. Like, well, wait, what were we doing all that time? Like, did it mean anything? Like, what was the Black Panther Party? One of the characters, as you mentioned, is a former Black Panther who's like very disillusioned with the work of the Panthers in a lot of ways, and thinks he can do better. As it turns out, he can't really, but he thinks he can, or he's going to try. And so, there's this sense of feeling as though all of these movements failed people individually, but also that maybe they failed. And so maybe we went about doing all of this stuff entirely in the wrong way. And there was some other way to go about doing this. And I think also on a very practical level, people just feel, there's a lot of sense of people feeling kind of unmoored or unsettled, right? Like these things were, these things became, these liberation movements, people began building their identities around them. They began building their hopes around them. They began building futures around them. And when it all kind of falls apart, folks are just sort of bobbing, they're quite literally unmoored. And sometimes they're also even unmoored, like just really economically, like we don't really talk about it, but like these were also jobs, you know what I mean? Like my father was in CORE, and like he was a journalist for CORE, and like that was his job. And then by 1982 or something like that, even in the late 70s, he didn't have that job anymore because it didn't exist. And so, it is a time of enormous like social upheaval that I think we often sort of don't think of, because I think the media just sort of thinks about it as like, it's all like Bonfire of the Vanities and like cocaine, you know what I mean? But like, it's not, but like all of this very serious, intense stuff was happening, which isn't always necessarily represented in like cultural products, you know what I mean? Like we don't see that version often in the movies. We don't see it. And if we do see it, it's very separate, right? It's like, here's a documentary about the AIDS crisis. Here's a documentary about what happened with crack. Here's a documentary about, mass incarceration. Actually, I don't think there are any. Well, there probably are some documentaries. Obviously, there's a book about it. But you know what I mean? Like as though these phenomena were like very separate from each other, when in reality, like there was this kind of gigantic shift in the country that happened. And so a lot of the book is interested, and I should say, lest it sound like I've sort of written a social treatise, like, what I'm interested, I'm a writer. So what I'm always interested first and foremost is character. So all of this, I can have all the lofty ideas I want to all day long, but if the book is to succeed in any way, these things have to be located sort of in the bodies and minds and hearts of the people who are moving around. But those are the kind of like, those are the concerns, or rather they are the things that I feel like are pressing against these people. And what they do inside of them, however, is very much determined by their personalities and their psyches and what they love and what they don't love and what their histories are and just kind of how they are as human beings.
And you get some of the intertwining of their personality and motivations in relationship to, I think, the intensity of there being no social network and a desire for one. And so the worst of times and the best of times of the 80s, really comes to bear when the characters fall on hard times, right? Because the possibility of moving and finding another Bonaparte, and that failure has a higher consequence when there's no social network. So I'm going to invite you to come to the microphone and ask questions. I have one more question, but I'm going to ask it as our brilliant audience members are preparing to ask theirs.
Please ask questions. I love questions.
Yes,
questions
we love
make
questions.
Me very happy, so please do.
So Kate, you ended by talking about the fact that you're a writer, and that this, obviously is beautiful novels driven by character, very complicated characters. Could you talk some about your process? What made writing this novel difficult? What parts did you find effortless? What was it like? What was your process with the novel, and what did you learn?
It's so sad. None of this novel was effortless. It was such a knockdown drag. It was about 8 years, I think, all told, that I was working on this book. And part of that was because for reasons that are entirely external to the book. Like Hattie had great fortune in being an Oprah pick, and so it was all very loud, right? Like it was a really loud. It was a debut novel. And so it was there was a lot of noise, and there was a lot of travel, and there was a lot of, which was an incredible blessing, obviously. But, everything, as George Michael once famously said, there's no such thing as a free lunch. I know somebody else said that, but, and I for propriety's sake, I won't say the circumstances under which he did say that. But anyhow, he, so there's no, for a long time, I think it just took me a very long time to, writing is it's a very private act, right? And it requires, you're sort of making these very quiet, very private decisions. You're sort of discerning things, or the value of things, or whether things are viable or not in this it's a very quiet, very internal process. And so for a long time, I couldn't get to quiet. Like it was just, anything about a sort of barometer of like an ability to discern or assess. It was kind of like all I ever heard was like the New York Times saying things, you know what I mean? Like it was like, it just became, external voices kind of hijacked my own internal processes. So that took a long time to kind of get back to myself after that. And then, the book itself was just a complicated book. Dutchess, none of the people came easily, but Dutchess, who's the Southern, the woman who lives in Bonaparte, she's a former blues singer. She's like loud and funny, and she's very, very, very smart. But like kind of a curmudgeon, or not kind of, she's absolutely a curmudgeon, putting it polite. She cusses all the time. She's, so she was easier. Like that voice came earlier on, but I didn't know what to do with it. Like I was like, well, you're a keeper because you're very clear. But I don't know where you go, so she just kind of hung around in like a weird limbo for a while I tried to figure out some other stuff. Toussaint was sort of the middle, kind of like, sort of I heard him, sort of I couldn't. But Ava, who carries a great deal of this book, I mean, the three of them are essentially the book's narrators. Ava was impossible. She and I didn't like each other. We didn't get along. We like couldn't talk. When we did, we would fight. Like it was really, really. And because she carried so much, it just took a very long time to get anywhere with the book, because I just couldn't hear her. I think I probably was like judging her, I think I was or sometimes I was sort of overly sympathetic towards her. At the same time, I was judging her. I was a little bit condescending, I think, and then she didn't like that, and so she's like, "Well, I'm not going to tell you anything if you're going to be like that." So it just took a very long time for she and I to kind of find enough of a piece together that I could, bring her forward.
Yeah. I mean, another part of hearing the voices is the echoing that happens in the novel. And so, there's these moments, and I'm sure all of us have experienced them, where you are realizing that you are doing the same thing your parents did, your mother did, and then immediately distancing yourself from the parents, saying, I am not like her. And so there's these repetitions, both personality, or I shouldn't say personality wise, but in terms of situational mirroring that's happening. And then also how one experiences oneself, one thinks of oneself. Can you talk some about how the secular effect helps drive the novel in some ways?
I mean, yeah, in many ways. I was making a joke to a friend of mine the other day. I was like, well, basically, I just told the same story twice, which in a sense I did, and in a sense is kind of is sort of the engine of the novel, right? Like the trajectories of the two main characters are very dissimilar in circumstance. Like one's in Alabama, one's in Philadelphia, etc. But the ways in which what is important to them and the ways in which things play out in their lives, they sort of, in many ways, like some of their decisions kind of revolve around or deeply influenced by very powerful men, by whom they are seduced. One of those powerful men, as it turns out, is a really good guy. The other one is not. At the same time that they are women who have an enormous amount of agency and selfhood, and both of them end up in lives in which sort of police violence and things like that become like a deep threat to the place that they live. Both of them struggle with motherhood enormously. I mean, I think a lot of this book is also about people really struggling with motherhood, and what that means, and what conventional ideas of motherhood are, and neither of them meet those ideas. So they have a lot of similarities, and that's very purposeful. Like I kind of wanted Bonaparte and Philadelphia to be sort of like calling back and forth to one another over time, and those characters to sort of be echoing one another in many ways. So it is very much, there's a lot of mirroring going on. And even I think when you read the book, you'll see that, imagistically there are things that are kind of very similar. There are events sometimes that are very similar. And that's a very purposeful kind of effect.
Thank you. So do you have questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm very excited.
Does this book pick up where your other book left off? And can you compare and contrast the two books, and how the cultures during those periods of time are differ or the same as they are now?
Thank you. It's a great question. My mic's still on? I think my mic's on. Is it on? Okay, good. So this book is very different from that book. In the sense that, I mean, like plot wise it's different, character wise it's very different, but it's always, my questions of obsession are still the same, and I imagine always will, right? So like both of them, the 12 Tribes of Hattie took place very largely in Philadelphia, and it spanned a lot of time. So it sort of began in the 1920s and it ends in 1980. This book is set very specifically in the mid 1980s. Half of it's in Philadelphia, the other half is in Alabama, as I said. So they're definitely not sort of, one isn't sort of following one another in that sense. But my sort of geographic obsessions, like Philadelphia enormously, are there. I think my kind of obsession with like very larger than life mother figures who are sort of super complicated, with whom one hopefully empathizes, even though you might not necessarily like them, I think is also there. I sort of make a joke sometimes that I just write books about failed mothers, and complicated mothers. So that's absolutely still there. And also characters that are that what we call, I think I sort of used this term earlier, even though I haven't found a better one, but marginal people. I hate all of that terminology. So perhaps I shouldn't use a catch-all. What I should say is that what I'm always interested in are poor Black people, particularly women. And so that is very much the case here. So in those sense, there are things that are familiar. In terms of the sort of the concerns of the books, though, I think are very different. Like the first book, I think, in terms of like the way plot and stuff, rolls out. The first book is very much a kind of a Great Migration book, I guess. Or I guess that's what everyone said about it, even though I didn't really necessarily think of it that way. But I suppose it is. And this book is not. And what I find interesting about this book is that I think, I've only just begun touring. It's only been out, not even 2 weeks, it's been out for like 10 days or something, right? And what I'm finding really interesting is that it seems to be a book that is less locatable for audiences. Like people could very familiarly be like, Black people leave the South and come North and meet, and have some problems and, whatever. Whereas this book, it doesn't really do that. I think it exists a little bit outside of many of the narratives that we have around Blackness in this country, right? Like there's a culty, utopic something or other, right? There's a homeless shelter. There are people who don't necessarily fit into sort of the way that kind of popular representations of Black people, good or bad. It's doing something else. And it's very interesting to me because thus far I have found that it seems to be, its reception is very different. And part of that is because there's no Oprah, but part of it is I think that because there's no easy sort of summary of these people or the project of the book. And there's no easy summary because it's a more complicated book in some ways, I think, but also because there is nowhere to sort of put these Black people in a way that kind of like translates very easily into like a TV show we all already saw. So that doesn't really answer your question, but it's an observation that I'm having as I kind of go through the early days of this book being out.
Yes, please ask a question. I mean, what I think that as you were talking, it also made me think about the failures of motherhood as an ideal for poor Black women and how the infrastructures or lack thereof for Black folks, for people in the 1980s in particular, exacerbate the ability to realize that ideal.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you so much for all you do and all your work. I am wondering 2 things. One, can you talk about the role of fantasy writing or how you get to fantasy writing and how liberation and also oppression sort of both themes sort of play in fantasy writing? And then also, could you talk a little bit more about your process? That was really fascinating to hear, really about sort of like coming into self and finding that quiet time to have these inner thoughts and conversations and just sort of like maybe how you even practically do that. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So in terms of, I'm always resistant to this term magical realism. I think it's like a really weird term that only gets applied to certain books. And I just have questions about it. But in a way, I guess I'm sort of playing with it, right? Like there's like what happens in Bonaparte is a real place. I mean, not in the world. Like it is inspired by a few places that were real. One of which still is. But in the terms of the book, it is an actual place, right? Like it is an actual pole in the book that people come from and go to, etc. At the same time that it is kind of mythological. And there are like a lot of fantastical elements. There's a sense in which it is because there's just these 5 old folks there that are kind of holding it down. One of the characters, Dutchess, has this sense that she thinks it's like disappearing out of time. Like she's like, literally, this place, I think it's disappearing. And of course, it is disappearing in a historical sense, right? Like they've lost 90% of the land that they used to have. There's like white developers that are sort of encroaching on the land, and so that people are sort of selling things on the side. They're losing things to tax sale. They're losing things to eminent domain. So there and that's real, as real as a fictional thing is, right? And the metaphor for that in Dutchess's mind becomes this idea, because I said they're on a river, right? The metaphor for that in Dutchess's mind becomes this sort of fog that she thinks is sort of slowly closing itself around this place. And so sometimes she wonders, like, well, if I leave, would I be able to get back, or would the fog have closed itself so thoroughly around it that I couldn't even return? And it is a very subtle element. Like, it happens, but it's kind of subtle, because I don't want it to become I wanted to straddle that line between, like, the metaphor feeling like that's maybe not exactly real, but also it could be. And I'm really most interested in the fantastical stuff as metaphor. Like, that's always, like, kind of, I find that you can sort of reach beyond exact extant reality for metaphors that are very powerful, that sort of straddle. So that's some of sort of how that happens. And of course there's like there's an enormous, like, literary history of doing that, Toni Morrison being the most obvious that I can think of, within the African American canon. And then in terms of process, this book took so long, and it took a lot out of me. And so, that the process of sort of feeling like I could kind of hear myself again, I wish I could say, like, oh, I did this and then it fixed it, right? It didn't. Time sort of fixed it. And then it even didn't fix it totally. It was really as though I had to sort of renegotiate it, right? Like, I can never be an unknown debut novelist again. Like, that's done. Like, I'll never get that back. And so that utter privacy that provided can never be recreated. We'll never have that again. It's gone. So it was more a matter of trying to sort of renegotiate. As my mentor said to me very beautifully one day, I was kind of complaining and having a fit about all of this, and she basically said, well, you will have to come to learn new ways to navigate the revised terms of your existence, which in fact I did. She's very wise, and incredibly just talks like that. And so that is what had to happen, and that of course took the time it took. But in the meantime, I mean, I think after it was better, and even during that time, I think the rest of it was just consistency. And I'm not one of these people that's like, I write every day from 9 to, I'm way too disorganized in my mind for all of that. I try to write most days. And like, actually, since I finished this book, I was like, I never have to write a book again. I haven't written in ages. But while it was still, exerting its demands upon me, I try to write most days. I don't have a time that I write. I don't have one specific place. In fact, my partner's always like joke because she says she can sort of see where I've been, because it's like coffee cup next to the couch, weird like snack on the living room table, something like bizarre on the bed. Like, I tend to kind of, so I don't have a specific place that I go. I just kind of start somewhere and then I get sick of it. And I'm like, then the mojo's gone here. I'll go over there, But it's mostly consistency. And that's not a very glamorous answer, but I think when it comes to writing, that's kind of the only answer there is. It's just like try to write more often than you don't, to whatever success or failure that happens.
You mentioned that you set this novel in the 80s for a particular reason. It was a period, a unique time, a reaction to social, political, cultural gains, activity of the previous decades. It looks like we're in a similar period now, a similar sort of inflection point, a sea change.
Man, you're going to make me have this like nerdy, oh no. Sorry, I have this whole theory about this, and now you're going to make me have to say it.
Oh, good. Yay. So I'm just curious why, or what you think about the time we're in now, and what you hope your story can help us understand and understand better. What do you want to accomplish with this story?
So I think so here's get ready for my long nerdy answer. So I was I was thinking, there's no way to begin this without it being really nerdy. So I was thinking about the Reconstruction. But I do think about that, and in part because it sort of has something to do with this book, right? Like, the people in Bonaparte have been on this land sort of impossibly for many, 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 many years. They kind of, its history would have begun with It's called Bonaparte in part because it's like the idea would have been that the French, at a certain point, America wasn't around, obviously, things we all know, right? So there's all these groups vying for land and control. So there's the French and there's the Spanish and there's the British and there's the Dutch at a certain point. So a lot of that part of the country at specific moments, the French were like really, in there. And so my idea was that this place would have been that French settlers would have brought African slaves to that area, cleared the land, etc. And then it would have changed hands. So the name would have come, in my mind, from French settlers. And so the book kind of exists all the way through, right? The sort of more of its mythological element is that these people live independently and freely far before probably that could have actually happened historically, right? And that's more of the magical realism kind of fantastical elements. Like at a certain point, all the plantation masters that keep trying to own them, they just keep dying. They just drop dead. And so these people just sort of end up kind of living there themselves. But in reality, there are a lot of like free Black settlements like all around the South and some even in the Midwest. There's a place called Nicodemus. There's a place amazingly called the Kingdom of the Happy Land that actually did exist on the North-South Carolina border in the foothills of the Appalachians. There and Mound Bayou, for readers of people like Zora Neale Hurston, Eatonville, So there's a ton of these places, and many of them did spring up during the Reconstruction. So I think of the Reconstruction a lot. And one of the things that I think about in setting this book in the 80s is that, to me, it's not the same. But, that sort of 60s and 70s period in which this little window of hope kind of opened because of all of this agitation, there is something analogous to the actual Reconstruction there, right? Like there is this period in which, after slavery, while federal troops are occupying the South, that there was this window of like something opened, something changed for a little while. It was not free of violence. There were a lot of lynchings. There were a lot of, sort of racial terrorism. But, Black people are going to school. You've got these reports of classrooms where there's everybody from people who are 5 to people who are 60, right? Wanting to learn to read, all these things. They're opening businesses, having offices, holding public office. People are voting. All this stuff is happening. And then 11 years later, federal troops pull out of the South and it all begins to end. Then it's Plessy versus Ferguson. And then it's over. And something very similar, I think, happens in that period leading up to about 1980. Not the same, but I think there's an analogy there. And I think there's a powerful analogy there. And so we get these freedom movements, all this stuff. Then Reagan comes, it's 1980, and it's done. It's absolutely done. And so the 80s begin to set the stage for the America that we live in now. I mean, the America that we live in now, of course, the stage is set many, many years ago, obviously, right? In very obvious ways. But the sort of modern iteration of the America we live in right now, I think we can see a lot of that stage being set in the 1980s. And even in the sort of disillusionment, like that swing from hope to kind of what was possible being circumscribed and feeling as though it were no longer possible, period. I think we see a lot of that now. And so I hope that you really should not have asked me this question. Look what's happened. But I hope, I guess in a way, I hope, first of all, I hope people just read it and enjoy it as a story, right? Like it's super plotty. It's got lots of suspense. It's an interesting book to read. But if, my aim is always that you can access a book on different levels, right? If you want to read for story and just be like, oh my God, what's going to happen to these people? You can totally do that and have yourself a great time. If you want to read for other things, you can read for those too. So my hope, I guess, is that it's asking questions about sort of how we got to this moment in the sort of modern iterations of this stuff. Like how did we get here right now? Like at what point did things change so radically? And what did it mean that they changed so radically? Who was left behind? Who was left out? How did the zeitgeist change? Like what did the new challenges become? So I'm hoping that it's a little bit of a mirror. I don't know if it will be, but I hope that it's a little bit of a mirror.
Well, I will say, first of all, for those of you who haven't finished yet, the last 20 pages will knock your socks off. So I'm not going to tell you what happens, but and she's like, no, don't say it. I'm just saying in terms of if you're reading for plot, don't put it down. I'll also say congratulations to all of you because bookstores are one of our last bits of social fabric that has knit together and is still in place, even though the ways we've written. And I also just want you to help me to thank Ayana for her brilliant book. And I hope that you all buy a copy and have her sign it.
Thank you all so much. And yes, I think they might have signed copies, but I'm happy to personalize them, I guess, right there. So please do buy a book, give it to your friends, and I will happily sign it for you and chat with y'all a little while. Thanks so much.